Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. To moderate panel 3, how to reduce inequality and foster inclusion and social mobility, we would like to invite Mr. Julio Javier de Martini Montes, Minister of Development and Social Inclusion of Peru. He will introduce the topic as well as the members of the panel that are joining us. Mr. Minister, you have the floor and the moderation of this roundtable. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I greet the ministers of state, the deputy ministers, and senior officials of the different governments, members of the academia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to welcome you to the third panel of the 40th session of ECLAC for it is part of one of the 5 UN regional committees. And today we are called upon to think about ways of reducing inequality, fostering inclusion, and social mobility. As we all know, Latin America and the Caribbean faces several challenges in a international context that is characterized by important changes, such as reduction of flow, foreign investment, the impact of climate change, and the technological transformations. It is within this context that building a more productive future that is inclusive and sustainable requires strategies and policies that are practical, that go beyond the simple identification of actions and objectives. It is for this reason that it is of the utmost importance to overcome inequality. Inequality has become one of the most complex problems of the region. In this sense, strengthening governance and social dialogue are key to formulate, implement policies and programs geared towards social protection, as well as developing skills, policies, and views that promote a social, inclusive environment. This panel seeks to talk about regional experiences that are successful in reducing inequalities and in implementing social protection programs for the most vulnerable population. We will look at the main challenges that impede or hinder the implementation of certain capabilities and how they impact the design and implementation of policies. We will also address additional factors to those that ECLAC has already identified to explain inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean, such as low economic growth that results in little dynamic labor markets with high levels of informality, disparities in salaries, regressive fiscal systems that perpetuate inequality, weak social policies that fail to reduce the impact of structural inequalities, deficiencies in the education system that show high rates of insatisfaction and dropping out of school and do not answer the requirements of the labor market, gender inequality that is persistent, and of course, the spatial segregation that entrenches inequalities in urban areas where 80% of the population of our region actually lives. In order to address this problem, we have with us 4 distinguished panel members. I'd like to introduce them to you. We have Mr. Kirk Humphrey. He's the Minister of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs of Barbados. He took on this position in 2022. He holds a master's degree in social policies and planning for developing countries from London School of Economics. And he holds a master's degree in public policies with a specialization in leadership and human rights from the School of Government of John F. Kennedy School and Harvard University. He has held different positions, Minister of Maritime Affairs and the Blue Economy between 2018 and 2022. He focused on sustainable development of the maritime resources. His main contributions have focused on promoting initiatives to address inequality and foster inclusion. Also joining us is Lais Abramo, National Secretary for Care and Family in the Ministry of Social Development and Assistance of Brazil. She holds this position since 2023. She holds a degree in sociology by Sao Paulo University. Her research has focused on gender approach, labor market, female employment, social inequalities in Latin America. Previously, she has been the director of the Social Development Department of ECLAC between 2014 and 2020. She led a number of investigations on social inequalities and gender inequalities. Her main areas of interest are the development of national policies in Brazil, particularly in areas associated to care. She also works with care policies for Latin America. Also joining us is Paula Poblet Moreira. She is a Deputy Secretary of the Social Development in Chile. She is in charge of designing social policies to improve the focalization of expenses to gear them towards vulnerable populations. She holds a degree in economy by the Chilean Catholic University. She has been a researcher for the National Council of Culture and Arts and worked in the Department of National Accounts in the Central Bank of Chile. She has also been a professor in undergrad and graduate degrees in different universities in Chile. She has taught on topics associated to economy and gender gap. Also joining us is Florencia Torche. She is a professor of public and international affairs and sociology at Princeton University. Finally, I would like to welcome you all. I would kindly ask each panel member to take about 10 minutes to answer 4 questions, the 4 questions that we are called upon to answer today. A first question is that the high levels of Latin America and the Caribbean show that the high levels of concentration of wealth is in the hands of a few, where a significant portion of the population is living in poverty. According to ECLAC, in 2022, the quintile with the highest level of income is 20 times greater than that of the lowest level. And in 2021 is 515. They account for 4% of the wealth of the region. In order to foster inclusion, we need to implement the intelligent economic policies. In this line, I would like to propose the following. What kind of successful experiences in policies to reduce inequalities can we experience or have we experienced in the region? In addition to that, question number 2, what are the key challenges to strengthen technical skills, operational skills, policies, and perspectives of institutions in order to reduce inequality in the region? Now, we need to think about the 6 causes of inequality that ECLAC has listed, such as slowdown in economy, high informal markets, regressive fiscal programs, ineffective social programs, weakness in the education systems, and low learning, gender inequality, among others. A third line of thought that we would like to hear your experience on is how important is strengthening governance and social dialogue in designing and implementing policies aimed at reducing inequality? Finally, what additional factors have you noticed to explain inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean, in addition to the 6 that have been studied by ECLAC? With these questions, I would like to give the floor now to the members of the round table. And before they begin their presentations, I would like to ask for a round of applause for them.
Perdón un ratito, antes de eso.
One second. Before that, I'd like to make a housekeeping. Oh, sorry, he corrects himself. Also joining us is Isabel Roman. She is the general coordinator of the State of Education prepared under the State of Costa Rica. She is taking place of the panel members from Chile. I'm sorry. So having said that, we're going to move on to our presentation.
Invitamos entonces a que nos pueda.
We would like to give the floor now to Mr. Kit Humphrey, Minister for the Empowerment of Persons and Elderly People of Barbados. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Very special good afternoon to all. Thank you for joining us on this second day in the afternoon period. It's always very difficult in the afternoon period, but thanks for being here. I want to thank the government of Peru. And of course, I want to thank ECLAC for allowing us to be here. We traveled very far to be here for this most important meeting. I also should say at the beginning that I'm very happy. The last few occasions that I spoke at a similar meeting, I expressed some concern about the role of the Caribbean in these relationships, but I must thank you, Mr. Salazar, for your personal effort in ensuring that the Caribbean feels a lot more welcome and integrated into these conversations. I also want to say that Barbados also wants to have a role in deepening these relations, and I will selfishly make an ad because we're also having a conference at the end of the month. It will be the 6th session of the Regional Conference on Social Development in Latin America and the Caribbean, and the 16th Ministerial Forum for Development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And for those of you who have not yet signed up for that conference, Mr. Salazar is more than happy to make sure you make your way there to Barbados, and you are all invited. It is, again, as I said, a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the interpreters as well before I begin, because I know a lot of your work has been for me and for my colleagues. So we thank you, those who are translating it into English and other languages, as well as the persons interpreting for the hearing impaired. I also think that at this point, this is a very welcome conversation for most of us to be having. And I have read some of the report, and I listened to the presentation made by you yesterday, very passionately made and very, I think, very much reflecting the fact that you know the material extremely well. And I found it particularly uplifting and very, very useful. The reality is that there's never going to be a single report that is all things to all people, but I think the report has made a significant contribution to the discourse and the one that we're going to have today, and of course, to the future of social policies going forward. We were asked to discuss how to reduce inequality and foster inclusion and social mobility. And if I'm being honest, this has been something that has concerned me as a young youth community practitioner. It concerned me as a student, both in the Caribbean and in the UK. It concerned me as a lecturer when I was at the university in the West Indies. And while I worked as a senior public servant in the government of Barbados and also for the government of Canada, and of course, now as a politician, this has concerned me. And the truth is, in all these various iterations of my own existence, I've held different views on how to reduce inequality. And I'm still very concerned that in a number of these areas, we still have not been able to hit the nail completely on the head. But I do think that the research that was done and the work that was done here makes a significant contribution to the discourse. In relation to the 6 factors that were listed by ECLAC, I won't go over all 6. But of course, if you pick any of the islands in the Caribbean, they all relate to us. And at this point, I also want to say how proud I am of the work that was done by the region yesterday, the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean countries who spoke yesterday so honestly and so openly in relation to some of the issues that we face that I won't go over, but I do think there is a new militancy in the way Caribbean people speak, and I totally endorse it as it speaks to how we see our own future going forward. In relation to some of the things that I think are successful in Barbados, particularly, I mean, a lot of the region shares a number of the same issues, but some of the things I think are particularly impressive, because as I read what was asked of us, it began by suggesting that, there's regressive tax policies in the Caribbean, well, in most of the countries that experience these kind of issues, which is true. It would be difficult to deny it. But I do think there are things about the way Barbados has approached our own tax policy, first of all, that I think is rather impressive. We've had in Barbados a reverse tax credit for persons who make $25,000 or less. Our exchange rate is $2 to $1 US. So persons who make under $25,000, they get a reverse tax credit at the end of the year to make sure that they have extra money in their pockets. For persons between $25,000 and $35,000, we give a compensatory income credit, which means that all of the taxes that they would have paid during the course of the year, we return those taxes to them. In those between $25,000 to $75,000, they pay 12.5% taxes as opposed to 20% where the others begin. So our tax system is not as regressive as some of the others, and I think many of the islands in the Caribbean share this kind of approach to how they go about doing their taxes. And of course, we began in Barbados in 2018 as the third most indebted country in the world, which speaks to the fact that, all the things that were said about us, high debt, and tight fiscal space, and so on. We began at 176% of GDP, and now it stands at 105% of GDP. So there are things that we're doing to make a difference. And as I get to the end of my presentation, I do intend to share with you some of these larger macro issues that I think we need to be concerned about as well. As it relates to how we've gone about trying to redistribute resources, we've done so in relation to land. As part of the Caribbean, we have a slave plantation history, so that the vast majority of the land in the region was owned by a small amount of families. I think 70% of the land at one point in Barbados was owned by 10 families. We've seen a redistribution of that through ensuring that persons who previously lived on the plantations could own that land at reduced rates to be able to begin that process of redistribution and empowerment and to end, or at least reduce, inequalities and inequity. In relation to education, the Caribbean has a very strong education system. Most of us have populations 95, 96, 97% literate. And of course, there are challenges, and we do need to reflect on those challenges. A significant amount of our resources are spent on social protection, significant amount, 11.4%, for example, of Barbados' GDP on social protection, including health. The same thing in relation to national insurance. So there are things that we've put in place to ensure that the most vulnerable populations have access to some resources. But I come to these meetings, if I am being frank with myself, and I haven't traveled somewhat, and for those of you who visited the region, you would have seen that, sometimes, even though it's true, you really can't believe what you hear. Because were you to take all that, Barbados sounds like the most perfect place in the world, and we have no issues. And we hear this from time to time in all these meetings, but there are serious issues. And I've always felt a certain hypocrisy just listing all of the good things, the things that have worked in relation to the way we've gone about doing a lot of these things. We've done a lot of good things, but things are not that good in many cases. And so when I started to think about, to reflect on the presentation and to reflect on, a lot of it was around the institutions, there is work coming out of Harvard that spoke to isomorphic mimicry or institutional limitations, where the Caribbean region, for example, and many other countries, created institutions that reflect the institutions that are in existence in larger, richer countries, and that these institutions look very similar on paper, but they're mimics, because they cannot do what the institutions in the larger countries do. But many of us, as a result of our own history and colonization. We then created these institutions that really cannot function the way they should function. And the reliance then on building social policies through some of these institutions is going to be counterproductive because they were never meant to do these things. We have situations where a lot of international organizations or multilaterals may say, you need to create this organization or that institution, and then we don't have the capacity to properly staff it, to properly monitor these projects, and so on. So there's a mimicry. And I think when we're reflecting on that, we have to look at the legitimacy of a lot of these institutions that we have created. And so that when you do these evaluations of the countries, in many cases you can't believe what you see either. Because a lot of the institutions that are created are really not fit for purpose. And I think in terms of, I saw a lot of the report asking for a reliance on institutions and institutional strengthening. We have to ask, are these institutions, regardless of strengthening or not, are these institutions able to deliver what they were created to deliver in the first place? That's one. I also think that we have to move away from this technical focus to a more adaptive focus. This idea that you have technical solutions for everything. There is a part in the region that is going to require a lot of unlearning, Most of the inequities that we see with persons with disabilities, gender-related inequities, family inequities, a lot of this stems from values and behaviors that were given to us, that we have adopted, we've inculcated, that we need to change. So that even if you start throwing more money at a lot of these things, without these systematic adaptive changes that work, people changing how they see these things, people recognizing that it's important for us to do this kind of work, then we're going to continue to have problems. And I think that is a significant amount of the work that we need to do as well. I also hold the view that leadership is going to be a big part of it. And I begin, of course, again, I should have said at the beginning that the Honorable Prime Minister Mia Mawali asked me to convey her appreciations to everyone at the conference, but particularly to you. I should have said that at the very beginning. So leadership is going to be a big part of it. And, I've seen as well, if you Google, this algorithmic bias, if you Google poor countries, Africa is going to pop up, perhaps. Caribbean is going to pop up, perhaps. But there's poverty everywhere. The first time I ever saw two persons fighting for the best spot by a garbage can, homeless people, was in England. The first time I've ever seen a mother and children outside, hungry, living on the street, was also in England. Not in the Caribbean, it was not in Africa. But you Google it, the algorithms are meant to reinforce some of these patterns. And I think there's also a view that we have to look at these algorithms that continue to perpetuate these things. I will try to close very quickly, but these are some of the things that we have to do, but there are also some external issues. The brothers and sisters from the Caribbean who spoke yesterday spoke to a number of these issues, so I won't go over them. But I do know that if we're going to address inequality, that we have a very impersonal, almost cruel, international financial services sector that has judged the Caribbean wrongfully for a long time. The tragedy is that coming out of a sugar plantation, when we were given preferential treatment, when that was taken, we were advised to go into financial services. That was the advice. We got into financial services. Apparently we did it too well. And now the financial services sector is also a problem. There has to be a point at which we recognize the goalpost is always changing for the Caribbean. And, if you want to talk honestly, let's talk about some of these things. I know that I'm probably out of time, so I will end by saying that at the end of the day, I think there are issues of sovereignty. Caribbean states feel many times that they're not felt, they're not heard, they're not seen, that there are a number of issues that are external to us. We could continue to do all the good things, and if you go across any of them, we've done all of the right things in many cases, but we still keep getting the same result. There's some external issues that we have to look at. The way we are rated, the indexes, how do they calculate these things? Not taking into consideration some of our own vulnerabilities, which we all spoke about yesterday. So I think this is a larger conversation. I think we can begin to heal if we start thinking regionally, the Caribbean bloc and the Latin American bloc. I think a lot of the multilaterals too also have to understand that as we have these conversations, that at the end of the day, there's not only one agenda, not the multilateral agenda. We also have our own agenda. And, for politicians, it is okay to say these things, but I think if you want to be able to drive work, politicians recognize that they have to drive the work and stay alive at the same time. So we have to pace the work so that people receive this kind of change and transformation at a level that they can absorb and hopefully be able to do a longer-term work and reduce inequalities in the longer term. But I think it is a comprehensive conversation. Hopefully we can continue it in Barbados at the end of the month. And again, I want to close by saying you are all invited, and I look forward to having you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Humphrey. Let's now give the floor to Laisa Bramo. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to greet the Minister of Development, Peru, the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, and all the persons here at the head table, and all participants. I really thank for the invitation. The invitation was addressed to the Minister, Wellington Diaz, who's asked me to represent him on this occasion, and it is a great pleasure for me to participate in this high-quality dialogue. I would like to focus on two of those four questions because I think that they are quite broad and we have just limited time. So the first one is related to the successful experiences to reduce inequality in the region. I think there would be many, but here I would like to highlight one, which is the experience in the building of care policies and systems are being developed in Latin America, and the affirmation of care as a right of everybody and as a public good, without which the economy, the institutions, and society as a whole would not work. I think that experience deserves careful examination because it is a huge experience, and from the pioneering experience of Uruguay, which in January of 2015 launched its national care system. Since then, many other Latin American countries are following that same path. And here I would like to highlight the role played by ECLAC, especially the regional Conference of Women in Latin America and the Caribbean, that has been key to move forward in the diagnosis, conceptual definitions, political agreements, exchange of experiences, technical assistance of the countries that have enormously contributed to those achievements. Achievements that I think are becoming a reference for the whole world. I had a chance of participating this year in the International Labor Conference in Geneva, representing Brazil, and one of the key discussions was decent work and the care economy in Latin America, and the ECLAC highlighted these topics, promoting their discussion very seriously. Care is a right and a need of all people. It is also daily work that uses large numbers of hours of millions of women in Latin America and the Caribbean, especially the poorest ones, the Afro-descendants, the indigenous women, those living in rural areas, and the most left behind urban areas. All that is a powerful barrier to complete the educational formation and professional formation of women and their insertion and permanency in the labor market and public life. Therefore, it is a very important aspect to reduce poverty, exclusion, and social inequality in the region. Let me just give you one example. In Brazil, 66% of women women with children from 0 to 3 years of age, many of whom are quite young, are not in the labor market, nor are they looking for a job, because of the very need to have to look after their children or the relatives and their homes. And another 67% would not be able to accept a job even if offered because of the very same reasons. Therefore, this comes to show how a very high percentage of women in the region cannot have access to the necessary means to overcome their own poverty and that of their families, and that's to reduce inequalities. Now, to make things worse, to get rid of this, we need the right care policies that can guarantee the right to be taken care of to all people who need that, and recognize and reduce the non-remunerated burden of work of women through the sharing of tasks between men and women at home and society, and in the same society and community and the private sector and the state. Also to promote decent work amongst all men and women care workers to reduce poverty, inequality, and exclusion traps. Without the deep transformation and the social reorganization of the care in our countries, and without any significant progress to build a care society as proposed by ECLAC and the Women's Conference, it will not be possible to reach gender equality in the labor market and society, and therefore to overcome one of the main causes of the trap of inequality identified by ECLAC. In Brazil, we're moving forward, starting with the administration of President Lula last year, through the building of a care policy, a national care plan, through an intersectorial and federal interaction with the participation of different spheres of economy and policies. We're convinced that all this that can face all these challenges does require that intersectorial and integrated approach, which is something that was highlighted in the ECLAC document, as well as dialogue and social participation. But at the same time, we are fully convinced that the care systems policies are very important policies or instruments to promote these public policies. One of the most relevant examples that we have in Brazil has been the integration of social protection, health, education, work, and social security policies within the scope of the construction of the care policy. I would like to take this occasion to thank ECLAC for their support, especially the Division of Gender Affairs, the Division of Social Development, SELADE, and the Brazil offices that are working on this process. Brazil arrived late in this agenda, and in view of all the slow progress we've seen in the country, social cooperation with Latin American countries facilitated by ECLAC and other UN organizations and multilateral organizations have been key. So we hope this collaboration may continue and is deepened. Regarding the second question, which is, well, I do think that there are some additional factors that I identify in addition to the 6 causes for inequality mentioned in the document. And here I would like to take up some lines of thought of the document itself, which is the idea that equality is not only a matter of social justice or rights, but rather it is a condition for having a medium and long-term economic system. And to overcome this persistent inequality in our countries, we need to deepen the knowledge about the access of the structure, their intersectionality, and their links throughout the whole life cycle of the individual. So here I go back to the matrix of social inequality in Latin America formulated by ECLAC in 2016. No doubt that the unequal inequalities in gender and territories highlighted in this document presented during this conference are key to face this inequality trap. And here I would like to point out another axis related to social inequality in Latin America. The ethnic and racial inequalities. I mean the indigenous population and the Afro-descendant population. And because of the same cases of ECLAC, they account for at least 34% of the population in Latin America. That is, 1 out of every 3 persons in Latin America is either indigenous or Afro-descendant. And that is a total of 212 million people. And those people are at a disadvantaged position in all the economic spheres related to income, health, education, social protection, access to quality work, as also shown by ECLAC on different occasions. Therefore, in my opinion, this is something very present in the current administration of Brazil through its policies. It is not possible to move forward and to overcome the trap of inequality, inclusion, and social mobility without putting this issue on the center of the core of the agenda. But why did I say at least 34%? Because that figure could be underestimated. The self-identification in population census, especially in the household surveys and in the administrative records in several of our countries, is still insufficient in spite of all the progress seen in recent years. And here I would like to mention once again the very important work of technical assistance to Latin American countries and the Caribbean, especially being developed by ECLAC and SELADE in this area of division of these issues. Let's not forget that all the governments in the region are committed with Goal 17 of the SDSs, which is to desegregate by gender, by income, and by ethnic and racial dimensions to break down all the dimensions for compliance of the SDGs. We know that in spite of that commitment, there's still a lot to be done in this area of ethnic and racial identification. And we know that statistics is one of the most severe ways of discriminating, because if what cannot be counted does not exist, and it's not a matter for public policies or development strategies. And that is why I wanted to point this out. Also understanding that facing these structural inequalities, going to the how, means not only to move forward to universal policies in health, education, social protection, responding to the needs of the population as a whole, but it is also necessary to develop affirmative action within the principle of universality, taking into account the differences contained in the National Agenda of Social Development and Inclusive, which is approved, which is another subsidiary agency of ECLAC. As a good practice, we could highlight the policy of racial and social quota to have access to tertiary education implemented in Brazil since the first half of the last decade of last century. That's a fundamental measure to reduce inequality through the inclusion of historically discriminated groups, such as the Afro-descendant groups, indigenous peoples, low-income population, and people with disabilities. As a result of the social struggles, and with the full support of previous administrations of President Lula and President Dilma, initiatives related to some public needs starting in early 2000 were followed by the law on a social quota for ethnic and social groups approved in 2012. That resulted in the promotion to reduce ethnic and racial inequality in having access to something so important, which is the technical education, professional, and university education. Just to give you some information, in the year 2001, the percentage of white students in public higher education was much more, and the number of students for Afro descent and indigenous was 36%. Now it accounts for 56.5% of the population. 9 years later, the Afro descendant students and indigenous students had access to most registrations in higher education institutions. That has had a huge impact on the level of access to education, capacities, competencies, and even in the research agenda of the Brazilian public universities that began to put more focus on those issues. A law approved last year extended that policy of affirmative action to postgraduate courses also. Well, those have been the examples I wanted to give, and I would like to affirm that the government of President Lula is fully aware of the depth and complexity of the inequality problems in our region and in Brazil, and that is why it is regarded as a top priority. The policies that are being taken up as of the beginning of his administration, together with all the innovations implemented, have shown that it is possible to move towards that direction. We know that this is quite complex and there's still a lot to be done, but regional integration and cooperation amongst our countries is of the essence to move forward. And that is why, on behalf of Minister Wellington Diaz, I reaffirm the commitment of the Ministry of Social Development to reinforce the regional assistance in ECLAC and its subsidiary agencies and keep deepening on this discussion. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Laís.
Thank you very much, Laís, for your brilliant participation. Let me make a correction to something I mentioned. Dear panelist Isabel Roman is not being replaced. She's actually very well invited here. Isabel Roman has a master's degree given by the National University of Costa Rica, the specialist in public policies and operating under the institutional framework of the National Council of Rectors of Costa Rica, CONARE. For many years, she coordinated a report on human development and sustainable development in Costa Rica, and she's been head of that coordination in Central America. She is co-author of several articles and books in many international reviews, and she's been a member of UNICEF, FLACSO, and many other agencies. So let me give the floor to Ms. Isabel.
Thank you very much to ECLAC for inviting me to partake in this panel and to share the floor with such distinguished members. First of all, I would like to compliment ECLAC, and I share with them this report. It is the framework for the 40th session of ECLAC, and the main conclusion that inequality, the lack of social mobility and inclusion go against the development, make social inclusion even deeper, and it makes it even more difficult to overcome the difficulties that the region experiences, such as the lack of development with high productivity, the deterioration of the well-being of people, the threat to democracy, the problems of citizenship and security, and inequality. We agree with diagnosis on the root causes of the problem, but the main question we have now is how to reduce these inequalities. What can we do? Let me offer some avenues to overcome these problems. In this sense, I'm going to divide my presentation in two parts, one with an overview, and the second part it will include certain recommendations in the field of education. First and foremost, I would like to bring your attention that we should not fall in the trap of good practices. They may be important and shed light on how innovation should come about. They should not deviate us from the discussion that the problem we face is systemic, and to deroot it requires complex activities. It requires redistribution of resources and the fight between practical powers. And this is exactly what the analysis states for the case of Central America. It is related to the design or efficiency of distributive policies that are funded and sustained for a longer term, and they should be universal. Secondly, I would like to pinpoint that the solution of the traps described requires political incentives. However, they are perverse, and they do not solve the problem, the bottom line problem, and do not prevent this from happening in the long term. We're facing an economy of policies where political agreements do not go beyond 4 or 6 years in most countries, depending on how long each administration is in office in these countries. This, without a doubt, affects the design of state policies and long-term planning. This, in the long run, favors the promotion of targeted policies, short-term policies, and it does not allow for universal policies that can protect the basic rights of people, nor does it foster its consolidation over time. Also, it is important to consider that the solutions proposed should not lead, as is frequently done, to refound the institutions as a whole. This is a complex path and not necessarily successful. We should have a practical perspective, and it should focus on how to design aspects and guidelines in the different areas, going beyond the silo approach. We should focus on problems, and we can think about territory, productive units, the capacity of the people involved, and funding. Fourth, what the document also states is that we need to reach agreements. This is very important and entails working more precisely on the methodologies of social dialogue to reach agreements, but not just that, to effectively implement them. This means we need to clarify substantive elements, such as having clear rules for the dialogue process so agreements can be reached. Then determine what an agreement actually means. Follow-up mechanisms, monitoring to see if they are actually implemented. And what happens if those agreements are breached? This makes us have agreements that have muscle and that are resilient. This is very important, and we have learned this in a democracy like Costa Rica. We can reach relevant agreements with the different political groups, but if they are not met, it will affect the people at large. One example of that is what we agreed to allocate for education, and unfortunately it was not followed through, and therefore the education system has faced the consequences. We need to have information systems, data gathering that can help us in tracking the fulfillment of the obligations and determine who is liable if an element is not fulfilled. Finally, we need to underscore that inequality is a problem that requires long-term agreements. So the solutions have to be linked to the fiscal solutions. Nowadays, countries are facing fiscal adjustments where the issues or areas that require sustainable approach, such as education, are not considered priorities by the governments or the ministries of economy. So this prevents us from advancing towards an education of quality. It is even worse. It is making us reduce or go back in the achievements that we had already obtained. In territories like Central America and the Dominican Republic, where only 10 years ago, at a regional level, 6 out of 10 young people between 15 and 24 years old were not attending school. Moving on to education, we agree with the document. It makes a call to place education at the core of the priorities and to move towards universal efficiency of education services. In this way, the quality would be the same for all students and not as is the case in the region where there are different education systems. There are strong internal inequalities within the different education sectors. This is not a tool of mobility. It actually does the opposite. It generates more inequality. The document rightly points out that education should not be turned into a determining factor to reduce inequality, promote social mobility and inclusion if we don't consider it a priority. If we continue to consider it as a second or third order of priority, it will not help in overcoming these traps. The education we provide today will yield results in the medium and long term. This is why we cannot forget this fact. The region is facing the worst education crisis in the last 40 years in terms of resources, learnings, and management. Recognize there is a crisis in the education center and not turn it into a normal is something that requires urgent attention. Education should be placed in the right place. This would be the first act of resistance in the inequality scenario. It should be placed at the right place so that we can overcome the traps. To achieve this centrality, I would like to highlight 3 items that are key. First, that we should not repeat the errors of the past when we sacrifice the resources that were allocated to education. The education gaps do not come about alone. They are the result of bad policies in education. In the past, we made mistakes that have had high cost for the region. For instance, to overcome the crisis and achieve macroeconomic and fiscal crisis by reducing investment in education. That's what we did in the last century, and we lost a full generation. The consequences of that has taken more than 30 years for the region to recover. This is why we need to have a clear view that we cannot make fiscal improvements in the countries by depriving our children, girls, adolescents, and boys from the education sector. We need explicit and concrete policies. The traps to development will not disappear on their own. We need to address them and break them down. As ECLAC was saying back in 2015, the gaps in education learning can be considered the source of all the gaps because they perpetuate the quality of our work, access to well-being, both throughout the life of each individual as well as throughout the generations and from one generation to the next. At the present time, we face an important dilemma when we most need to invest in education to overcome the crisis of learning, to save a generation and move forward towards the schooling of the 21st century. We are reducing the budgets that are allocated to the education sector, and we are far behind what the OECD countries are investing in education. This is the worst scenario that we may have. The worst we can do is reduce investment in education, make it unsustainable, and not generate the reform so that it is a quality education as is required. The second aspect is that we need to improve the quality of teachers and put at the center of the training of teachers the learning of students. Without quality teachers, we will not have the education we need to overcome the learning crisis. Our education systems should become social mobility tools. If we don't work on the teachers, we won't be able to overcome this. We need to create a virtuous circle which requires the articulation of different levels of education for our professors. We need to also have recruitment processes and hiring processes by the ministries of education that guarantee the suitable and adequate profile of our teachers. We also need to ensure that those teachers get the appropriate working conditions, the salaries that they deserve, so that they will stay in the public education systems. We also need to have monitoring and evaluation systems that are constructive, that generate evidence on what our teachers and students know and what they don't know. And on that basis, develop different mechanisms for them to overcome that lack of knowledge. They should be the basis for the schooling, the leveling programs that we need to implement. It is time to be aware that the education system requires seeing what's happening in the classrooms. The last report on the state of education had a strong impact, and it was on the front pages of the different media. Students that at the age of 10 don't know how to read or write, they don't understand a simple text. This was what we saw in the front page of the media. That has a big impact. There are some mistakes that no student should be making in the 4th grade. But this is the kind of mistakes we can see in our region nowadays, that at the age of 10, as the World Bank stated, show that they have not acquired the basic knowledge, that they're lagging quite behind. If they don't know how to read or understand a text, then they're going to have serious problems in science, in math, and also in developing the digital competencies that they so much need in the current time. In order to give this quantum leap and to achieve the levels of productivity that we need in the region, we need to bear this in mind. I'd like to leave you with a last thought. Just like Costa Rica, the region has to make a strategic decision. To have an education that is written in Spanish with S and without an accent is not what we want to look at. And to have quality with us written with a C is not what we expect for our next generation. Thank you very much, Isabel, for answering my questions and for your comments. I would now like to give the floor to the next panel member, Florencia Torch. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. I would like to thank the colleagues of ECLAC for inviting me to participate in this meeting, and particularly in this panel. I would also like to thank our hosts in Peru and Lima. It is a great honor for me to share this panel with co-panel members. I have learned quite a lot about their programs and studies based on what they have mentioned in these last interventions as they try to promote development and well-being of people in their own countries. My presentation is going to focus today more on mobility, and what I'm going to try to share with you is how important it is to think of mobility linked to reducing inequality. This should be an objective that every policy seeks. Why should mobility be seen as a relevant objective? Let me share with you a definition. When we talk about mobility, people understand very different things, and we get mixed up in the concepts. What I'm going to say is perhaps the most conventional definition of mobility. When we research about mobility, we mean the association between the parental income when their children are small and growing and the income of their children when they are adults. The idea here is that a strong association indicates low mobility. In other words, children's income is determined by what we could call accidents of the cradle. That means whether or not their parents had resources or wealth. Weak association indicates high mobility, which is quite the opposite, a situation in which people who become adults have a similar chance of accessing economic success or failure for that matter, irrespective of their parental resources or how wealthy their parents were. And the way we define this conventionally is with this simple figure. We have the income of parents in the x-axis and the income of adult children in the y-axis. The red dotted line shows the low mobility. This is where the income of parents greatly depends the income of their children when they're adults. And generation after generation, we repeat each other or the economic stance. That red, or the black line identifies a situation of high mobility, where the income of adult children does not depend or depends little on the parents' income. This doesn't mean that every person's income will be above this line. There are certain variations. What matters is that this variation does not depend on how wealthy or poor parents were. It does not depend on whether we were fortunate to be born into a wealthy family or not. Now, based on this image, we can say the following. Mobility is measured by the association between parental income and the income of adult children. There's a strong association, and it captures the equality of opportunity. And it is very important because it helps in measuring equality at certain point in time. We use the Gini index or other units of measurement. I would like to suggest that mobility is a desirable objective of policies. It promotes efficiency when we use the talents of everyone in our society, irrespective of whether they come from wealthy or poor families, and equity. It offers equal opportunities to all members of our society. We know that these are used as an objective that can help in overcoming the trade-off. But this objective cannot be thought of isolatedly. It only makes sense, and this is what I'd like to suggest, in a context where we promote high growth of the population and also their well-being. This is something we can see. And going back to our figure, let me show you something different. Here you can see two different contexts to stylize the definition of low mobility in red and black, and in black high mobility with low growth. What you can see in that black solid line is that for the children, it means that they have low income in general, generally speaking. There's a lot of mobility for sure, but there is little correlation with the income of parents. Most of the population is in a worse situation than their parents. It's a dramatic situation that we may have experienced here in Latin America. Within this context, mobility is not a desirable scenario, although there are many opportunities. The opportunities do not take the population to increase their well-being, and as we have seen, it may affect democracy and result in social conflict. Therefore, the situation that could be a policy objective is to work on both. High mobility in a context of high economic growth. Very briefly, I would like to talk about the promise of mobility, where inequality is not a serious problem for society if there's high mobility. This is very important for Latin America and the Caribbean. As we know, these are very unequal societies, and as Alan Couric said, he was actually the chair of the White House economic advisors. If low-income people achieve high income at some point in their life, or if the children of low-income parents have the opportunity of having access to high income, then mobility happens. So inequality is of a lower concern when this is possible. This promise of mobility is something worth considering in high unequal context. Is there any policy that can promote mobility in high inequality context? The empirical evidence suggests that there is not such a case. I'm not sure if you can see this table, but what you can see on the x-axis is that mobility is right the opposite. In the y-axis, the speaker corrects herself. In the x-axis, we have inequality, and in the y-axis, we have the intergenerational mobility. We can see that in highly unequal countries, there is little mobility, and it is in this sector where we find Latin American countries. This is in the top right-hand corners, and in the countries where there is less difference, where there is more equality, the mobility is much the same. So the best policy to promote mobility in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean is to reduce inequality. And what specific policies should decision makers or policy makers make to promote mobility? Well, considering that the concept of mobility is connecting parents and children, it is connecting one generation with the next. In the short term, the policies that promote mobility and the policies that support or reduce inequality at the same time to promote policies are the ones that distinguish and separate the parental investment, as the other panel members were saying. For instance, we need to have kindergartens that are of high quality so that the families can send their children to high quality education levels, to accompany families throughout the pregnancy and afterwards, to provide different education support for marginalized and vulnerable peoples. Many of these initiatives have been tested in Latin American countries. Some of them have been quite successful, as a matter of fact. The challenges that we see in this context are multiple, and as someone from the academic sector probably knows less about this than the policymakers, but this entails coordinating a portfolio of policies, not only isolated policies, but they should be within a package, as Isabel was saying. And not only that, but this should remain over time, beyond the electoral cycles. The electoral cycles are very short when we are trying to break this cycle of parents influencing the future of their children. We need to assess this policy portfolio and be ready to change it whenever it is so necessary. Mr. Minister, how much time do I have left? Should I stop here or should I wrap up? The last item I would like to suggest very humbly is to remind ourselves, since we're talking about the Latin American and Caribbean context where mobility can be explained by a high level of concentration of revenue in certain wealthy groups. The mobility in Latin America does not depend on the persistence of poverty overall, but also the persistence of wealth. And here you can see this table from Chile, my home country. I'm not singling out a country as if this country were a negative example of the region, but unfortunately, the data on mobility is not available for many countries in the region. This is a deficiency. I use the Chilean case because we do have the data. In the x-axis, we have parent income, and in the y-axis, we have children's income. This is with real data. In the lower and middle income levels of the society, there's a lot of mobility. The line is quite horizontal. And it is in the economic elite that the line is diagonal or even vertical, which means there is an enormous reproduction of wealth. This means that people who are wealthy transfer that advantage to their children, who will have high income levels as well. The pattern of mobility will probably be mirrored in Latin America. So promoting mobility requires considering both the persistence of poverty and the persistence of wealth. And you well know how big this challenge is. There are different aspects of public policies that cannot or should not be considered. However, there are some avenues that can be taken into account to promote mobility in the more vulnerable sectors that do need the resources. Promoting mobility also requires consideration of the intergeneration persistence of wealth through parental investment in their children's human, social, and financial capital. There is even greater challenge. One avenue is to promote higher tax revenues and more progressive tax systems. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Florencia. This brings us to the end of the presentations by the panel members. Let me highlight some of the topics that we have heard this afternoon and that we have all taken due note of. In this panel, we are talking about reducing inequality, fostering inclusion, social mobility. And in light of what I have heard from the panel members, from the Caribbean, from Central America and South America and everything that drives the studies to find solutions to the common problems we face, we need to constantly revisit our analysis and diagnosis. And we need to think about finding a quicker solution. The interventions by the panel members have highlighted important topics: the relevance of education, the social protection that needs to accompany such policies and such social investment in education. There is also a cross-cutting topic: public health. And this cycle that we know of a human being since birth, and growth throughout the person's lifetime. All this is the matter of study of the investigations that have been presented and of finding avenues to overcome these problems and overcome inequalities in Latin America and the Caribbean. But all of these findings need to be accompanied by something that we are trying to balance out here in Peru. How can we find a balance between economic growth and social growth, economic development and social growth? These are very important aspects to take into account, but there must be some funding. And this funding needs to come from the sound, permanent promotion of economic development. It should be accompanied by the social development that our people so much need, particularly the most vulnerable.
If we do not understand that, while those political decisions that obviously come together with technical and scientific approach, if you do not have that going hand in hand, we will have a very slow path, and in some cases, something completely opposite to what we all want. And that is why, personally, from our country, this is a country that welcomes you all with lots of expectations and warmth, we send you out this message of ongoing work, that urgent work that we should conduct to close those gaps. And that is why, as a first conclusion, I would like to point out that according to the successful elements to reduce inequality in the region from the Barbados experience, it's important to propose policies related, first of all, to a fiscal and a tax system that substantially improves with the approach of the payback of taxes or the redistribution of wealth. They've also mentioned that the redistribution of soils is important to reduce inequality, improving expenditures in social protection, and to have innovative approaches and getting out of the box. It is of the essence if we do not want to face the same problems. And as a second conclusion, I would also like to say that based on what Lais pointed out regarding the situation in Brazil, we see that improvement in the economies of our countries can be seen when you start thinking about decent work of women. And Lais has given us great examples, and we here in Peru, we are working from the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs, and the evidence is right there in the social knit. The opportunities you give to women, which are very often household heads, they can take this opportunity and thus break the poverty cycle. And then they can move on to the other element, which is education, protection systems, care systems. That is a great proposal we see in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the care policies are of the essence. They are key for the transformation and thus overcome one of the main causes of inequality. The construction of integrated care policies are key instruments to reduce inequalities. And inequalities should also include, by life cycle, ethnic inequalities. By way of third conclusion, I would like to share with you what Isabel has commented upon, which is the transformation of the redistribution exercises, for which purpose we do need comprehensive and redistribution policies, because very often there's comparison against long-term policies. Therefore, we need strong social and economic policies that may go beyond different administrations and thus attain agreements with lots of muscle and resilience. One of the main concerns we have as public officers, something that cannot let me sleep, is how come these transformations we're making, whenever we have to take up this responsibility, which is the honor of the changing our nations, how can they have continuity so that we do not start all over again every 5 years here in Peru, to start being creative again, to destroy everything and start all over again? And who's behind all this? Hardly hit the most vulnerable population that does require these policies, and we should do this with sustainability in time, with results, with a social commitment and sensitivity of all the stakeholders, all those that participate in the development of our countries. Therefore, as Isabel very well put it, we need to strengthen the social and economic policies that may go beyond different administrations, and therefore it is important to have strengthened information systems, sound systems that can allocate more resources in areas like education. That I fully agree with that, and therefore it's important to invest in the quality of education. Otherwise, we'll still keep the inequality gaps. I would also like to share with you that, based on what Isabel pointed out, here in Peru, we want to do something. This information, these strengthened instruments are very important for us nowadays, and that is why some months ago, here, we've opened up an office specialized in education that goes beyond bureaucracy, with very high technical capacity that can show us the way of or where to invest. Social investments, that is, where, how, with whom, and when, and measuring it all the time. And turn this into a social culture so that it may go beyond the different administrations, so that it can be adopted by the population itself, that will understand that with that activity, there will be a better redistribution of wealth. If it's duly focalized, what we'll have are better care systems. And if it is duly focalized and redistributed, they will have a better investment in education, health, infrastructure. And there's nothing more powerful than the sense of belonging, because if you feel that it's yours, you take care of it. And if that is the case, I'm sure that it will go linked to the decisions made by the policymakers. By way of fourth conclusion, Florencia mentions mobility, so important in our countries, especially because it is linked to the goal of decreasing changes, because it promotes efficiency and equality, provided that you promote improvement of living conditions in the population, provided that all that is done, there's more equality. Quite a challenge for us. But especially we have an ongoing task that involves a high level of responsibility. And as Kirk said, we need to get out of the box. But in addition to that, we need to see how we are monitoring everything that we're doing, and that the systems that are seen in our region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, have to have that sustainability that's so necessary to have better equality. I am absolutely honored and pleased to have heard these panel members giving us quite excellent approaches. We would love to keep on listening to them, but unfortunately, we have time constraints. However, I would simply like to congratulate and thank the panel members, thank the Economic Convention for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, for having had this 40th session of ECLAC here in Lima. Thank you very much to all of you. Have a good afternoon.
Muchas gracias, ministro. Se invita.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. The delegations that may wish to take the floor are invited to do so for not more than 2 minutes. Kindly lift your name tags to make up a list of speakers. Mexico, you have the floor. Sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd also like to thank the panel members for such illustrative presentations full of ideas that will be beneficial for all our countries. One of the most important instruments adopted by Mexico is the creation of the non-taxing pension systems to close the inequality gaps and to have access to social protection. The idea is to guarantee a basic income to those people in poverty, especially to indigenous peoples and Afro-Mexican communities. This policy has been key to face the structural inequalities affecting these vulnerable groups, allowing them not only to receive economic support, but also to be actors of their own well-being and development. Social inclusion cannot be solely understood as a matter of economic support. For it to be effective, it should come with an approach that acknowledges all individuals as title holders. And this approach, Mexico promotes programs of well-being and public policies that place individuals at the core of government actions, recognizing them as subjects of right instead of simply receivers of support. Social inclusion also involves the creation of opportunities so that the people may have an active participation in the economic, political, and social lives of their communities. Social mobility is one of the key challenges we face as a region. In Mexico, we acknowledge that in order to increase social mobility, we need to close the structural gaps that limit access to education, dignified employment, health services, and social protection. And to do that, we've started a set of policies to guarantee access to quality public services, especially for those most vulnerable groups. Mexico has given major steps to increase minimum wages, which has a clear way to attain a more fair distribution of wealth. Mexico has promoted a development model with justice, making sure that public policies are aimed at the equitable distribution of income and wealth. Inequality and exclusion are deeply rooted problems in our societies, but they can be solved if we work all together and committed, adopting inclusive public policies and promoting equitable development. Mexico is firmly committed in the building of structures so that all people, regardless of their origin and social condition, may have a chance to fully participate in the economic and social lives of our countries, of our nations. It's based on UN notion of common well-being, shared prosperity, and renewed multilateralism promoting inclusive and sustainable development for all. I reiterate the desire of Mexico to continue collaborating with ECLAC and all the countries in the region in the creation of policies with concrete actions to be able to move forward towards a more just and inclusive and prosperous Latin America and Caribbean. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mexican delegation. We give the floor to the delegation of the United States.
Madam Chair, thank you, Minister, and thank you, panelists, for a really interesting discussion. And I want to start by echoing Minister Humphrey's appreciation for our interpreters once again, and our sign language interpreter as well, for their ability to make this interesting discussion more inclusive and accessible. So thanks very much. And I want to echo that reducing inequality and fostering social inclusion and social mobility is indeed central to the progress of our societies. The United States, like the majority of our UN ECLAC member countries, enjoy a rich diversity within its population. We remain committed to addressing challenges brought about by inequality and a lack of opportunity, not only within our borders, but in partnership with nations across the globe to serve the needs of all people, especially those facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. We greatly appreciate working with many ECLAC member countries to strengthen these efforts across the UN system through the Summit of the Future process. Inequality in education, healthcare, digital access, transportation, and economic opportunity traps entire generations, stifling their potential and dimming their prospects for inclusive development. But as a global community, we can break these barriers with targeted collective action. The United States believes that reducing inequality, fostering social inclusion, and promoting social mobility are bedrock principles of a just and peaceful society. We must all strive to build economies and communities where every individual is treated with respect and dignity and has the opportunity to thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, age, religion, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, sex characteristics, disability, and/or economic status. We see inclusive economic growth as a fundamental pillar to achieving sustainable development and enhancing social mobility. This is the reason we have expanded our outreach in Latin America and the Caribbean, such as through USAID's inclusive development programs and prosperity partnership initiatives that empower marginalized communities by expanding access to education, healthcare, and entrepreneurial resources. We are also addressing systemic barriers by promoting digital safety and inclusion. Access to technology and digital literacy are practically prerequisites for participation in the global economy, yet too many remain disconnected. These are also core elements of the Summit of the Future's Global Digital Compact. We stand firm in our commitment to work alongside partners in Latin America and the Caribbean to combat racism and promote respect and inclusion, recognizing that systemic racism is not only a moral issue, but also an economic one that hinders progress and deepens inequality. The United States Special Representative for Racial Justice and Equity has met with indigenous leaders throughout the region, co-led the first meeting of the White House Subcommittee on International Indigenous Rights, participated in the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and launched the State Department's Indigenous Youth Leadership Coalition, a representative network to elevate the voices of indigenous youth in global civic and political conversations. As we continue to address these pressing challenges, we are keenly aware that our success depends on strong partnerships. We recognize the tremendous work being done by governments, civil society, and the private sectors across Latin America and the Caribbean to tackle inequality and foster inclusive development. The United States stands ready to support our partners in these efforts, sharing our expertise, resources, and commitment to justice. Thank you again.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And we now give the floor to the Norwegian delegation.
And thanks to the panelists for very interesting perspectives. Inequality within countries is increasing. And after the pandemic, inequality is also increasing between countries. Inequality has its social aspects, but it is also fundamentally economic, as I think the last panelist touched upon. To make real progress, we must increase resource mobilization from all sources, including fair and progressive taxation. We must work to reduce corruption and illicit financial flows. Transparency, integrity, and accountability are key principles at all levels and essential for building trust in national and international governance. Tax revenue is a cornerstone of every country's long-term social progress and one of our most important tools for reducing inequality. Norway continues to invest in capacity building for tax administration in our development cooperation. At the same time, we work for a conducive international environment to support national efforts. Norway shares a common interest with Latin America and the Caribbean in mobilizing resources to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. In order to achieve our objectives, we must do more to fight and curb the leaks from tax evasion and illicit financial flows. This is a global problem which exacerbates inequality and erodes trust in democracy and public institutions. Lastly, I would like to take the opportunity to mention that Norway is one of the facilitators for the declaration of the 4th Financing for Development Conference in Seville, Spain in 2025, together with Mexico, Nepal, and Zambia. We will, in the coming year, hold consultations with ECLAC and other regional commissions on the process. We look forward to collaborating with all member states for a renewed and strong commitment to finance the Sustainable Development Goals during the final stretch to 2030. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We give the floor to the delegation of St. Lucia.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me, of course, thank the panel for its cerebral presentations. I believe they illuminated the whole issue of reducing inequality and foster inclusion and social mobility in a way that have led to a deeper understanding of the challenges of this particular hemisphere. I want to, of course, zero in on a specific statement made by one of the panelists regarding the need to strengthen social policies that go beyond administrations. And this is one of the fundamental challenges we face. Sometimes an administration may set in motion progressive policies. And because of the democratic system that we have, we need to respect the will of the people. And then the agenda of development is interrupted. And then those progressive policies never reach maturity to give birth to the type of results that are required for the major interventions that we need so that we can reduce poverty and inequality and really deal with the problems that threaten to pull us down. So this in itself is a very important barrier. Now, how do we ensure that our progressive policies reach maturity in our democratic setting? And I think there is a pressing need for us to cultivate greater awareness of the need to ensure that true and real democracy is established. So we need to now subject existing mechanisms to new levels of critical examination, because free and fair election is a mere symptom of democracy. True and real democracy is to test positive for the wise and frugal use of power, or conversely, to test negative for the misuse and abuse of the mandate given via free and fair election. Sometimes we set in motion progressive policies and the same administration continues. And good policies sometimes could be frustrated by poor legislation. And we need to support the progressive policies with a legislative agenda that could deliver for the people of the country. So I think there is need for us to look at our national programs, look at our approaches, especially in the Caribbean region, with small, vulnerable, and open economies. And we certainly have a narrow band of policy options to really address the pressing but legitimate needs of our region. So I end by indicating that we need to examine ways of doing things, our existing mechanisms, the existing approaches, and see how we can be more efficient and effective in setting in motion innovative responses to the challenges that tantalize us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We give the floor to the delegation of Antigua and Barbuda.
Chair, I am honored and indeed grateful for the opportunity to participate in this very important meeting, the 40th session of the ECLAC, held in this beautiful city of Lima. I'm equally delighted for the opportunity to dialogue on critical issues and ideas that will shape the future of beloved Caribbean and Latin America. And do look forward to examining the proposals for the transformation as we move towards a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable development model in the region. I refer to a model akin to the comments made by my colleague from St. Lucia. We just recently celebrated 30 years of solid and important work by ECLAC Caribbean through the Caribbean Development and Cooperation Committee and its meeting held in Trinidad last month, providing a forum for the exchange of ideas and strategic issues that have and will continue to influence and guide regional positions. It is certainly my hope that this committee will continue for another 30 years at least, providing a space for ongoing dialogue and address the many issues affecting Latin America and specifically, in this instance, the Caribbean. As we gather here today at this 40th session, representing various government agencies and civil society, it is my hope that our deliberations will enable robust debate, and already we have been engaged in robust debate, and the exchange of innovative ideas for the region's economic, social, and environmental development. At the same time, examining the activities carried out by the Commission during the previous year, while setting priorities for the program of work that will guide the Commission's future endeavors. Currently, the main sustainable development priorities for my country, Antigua and Barbuda, over the next 3 years, which are all aligned to the SDGs, forms part of my country's implementation plans executed in partnership with the UN Development System. These priorities include our macroeconomic management in the sector of tourism, agriculture, and the blue economy, competitiveness and enabling in business environment to include digital economy, infrastructure, energy, housing, urban development, enhanced social and gender inclusion, which highlights the reduction of poverty and vulnerability and gender mainstreaming, improving access to quality education, affordable health care, and improved productivity, and adoption for climate change. That, of course, includes disasters management and environmental sustainability. We view our partnership with the United Nations Development System through the various agencies, UNDP, UNFPA, WFP, and the UN Regional Office of the Eastern Caribbean, as providing a very holistic collaboration strategy with my country and other local partners to advance national sustainable development priorities. So as we begin the process to accelerate the implementation of the Antigua-Barbuda Agenda for SIDS, the ABAS, my country remains committed to support the efforts of all SIDS to achieving sustainable development and resilient prosperity. As discussed and highlighted in various presentations made during the last few months, our programs and projects must be targeted and results-focused, enabling SIDS full ownership of the Abbas while seeking to establish partnerships as equals, upholding values of equity, mutual trust, transparency, and accountability over the next 10 years. It was clearly identified and articulated during the recently held Caribbean Development Corporation Committee's meeting that in the Caribbean we are challenged with deficits in institutional capacities, affecting our ability to effectively achieve regional development objectives. It is for this reason that the work of the United Nations and its many agencies and development initiatives assist governments in the Caribbean to address the institutional challenges and strengthen our capacity to successfully implement the recommendations of the Abbas while achieving the SGD targets. In Antigua and Barbuda, there is a strong partnership between the government and a number of United Nations agencies to the establishment of the Common Premises Agreement that enables agencies to coordinate and collaborate more effectively on the ground. Colleagues, you are very much aware that due to the increase in destructive hurricanes and other natural disasters and an unpredictable world, that the future of SIDS without adequate economic measures or measuring tools that do not fully recognize and respond to competing and growing vulnerabilities of future is gloomy. Without an MVI that shows a data-driven manner how some countries are more vulnerable than others, SIDS' ability to withstand pandemics, economic shocks, disasters, and climate change will be lost. In conclusion, I would like to state that Antigua and Barbuda are extremely appreciative of the contribution made to the Caribbean development by the ECLAC. This institution has played a significant role in supporting the development of Caribbean countries through various initiatives and programs aimed at promoting economic growth, sustainability, and social equity. ECLAC's extensive research on economic and social issues affecting the Caribbean has helped member countries design and implement policies that address our unique challenges. Studies provide valuable insights into such areas as trade, investment, and sustainable development, and I remain positive that the program of work for 2025 will further enhance the sustainable development process in the Caribbean and help us to continue our efforts to address the challenges of the impact of climate change, high debt levels, low economic growth, finance constraints, declining export capacity, and high unemployment. Antigua and Barbuda leaves this meeting satisfied, confident that together we can continue to shape and craft an ECLAC in the image and likeness, responding to needs, developmental and others of the Caribbean and Latin America. Chair, I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We have finished the list of speakers. I would like to thank Mr. Julio de Martínez Morales, Minister of Social Inclusion of Peru, for guiding our debate, and also the members of the panel that have accompanied us in this panel on how to reduce inequality and foster inclusion and social mobility. We have come to the end of our second day. We will meet again tomorrow in this room at 9 a.m. We will start our third day of the 40th session of the Economic Council for Latin America and the Caribbean. We will now invite you to the cocktail offered by the government of Peru in honor of the delegations. This cocktail will be held at 6 p.m. in the Guayamarca archaeological site. It is only 2 blocks away from this hotel. The staff of the organization will show you the way to the event. We will walk there and we will leave 20 minutes before 6 p.m. You're all invited to attend a cocktail. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.